With its 4.3 AMOLED display, the Retroid Pocket NOVA is the bright new star in Retroid lineup. Hey everyone, RetroTechDad here, and I've got quite the familiar looking cardboard box with the Made in China stamp on it, and you know what that means, it's time for a new Retroid handheld. This time around, Retroid returns with their highly anticipated NOVA. So let's find out what makes this exciting and crack the seal on this package, and quickly roll through the specs, and you'll probably find that the NOVA has come a long way since the Retroid Pocket Mini. It's probably not much of a surprise, but the NOVA is powered by Qualcomm's QCS8550, and if you're wondering what the heck that is, this is the Internet of Things variant of the well-known Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, just without the cellular modem, and functionally features the same core layout and performance as well as the same Adreno 740 GPU that we now have seen in countless devices, including Retroid's own Retroid Pocket 6. This is paired with the choice for either 8GB of LPDDR5X RAM and 120GB of UFS 3.1 storage, or an upgrade to 12GB of RAM and 120GB of storage. Sadly, we don't have the option for increased internal storage, but as always, we do have the option to expand storage with the microSD slot. Pricing starts at $229 for the 8GB 128GB model, and then increases to $269 for the 12GB 128GB model. The NOVA is available in quite a few fun colors, including Ice Blue, Clear Purple, Watermelon, Crystal, GameCube, 16-bit, and then Black. The pre-order bonus ends at the end of July, which includes a free bumped back shell and glass screen protector. And the good news is that by the time this video goes live, Retroid has announced that they have already begun the shipping process for the NOVA. The model I have on hand here is the 12GB 128GB model in Ice Blue, and I did personally order the 12GB 128GB model in Clear Purple, with a set of the Ice Blue D-pad and buttons that I probably should change out for a different color, since I can now just swap between the review and retail units. With the NOVA we get Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, a 5000 mAh battery with 27W charging and support for charging separation, which we will examine further later on in this video, a 3.5mm audio port, and a USB-C 3.1 port for charging, data, and video out up to 4K at 60Hz with Android 13 out of the box. Finally, we probably have the most important inclusion here for the Retroid Pocket NOVA, and a great excuse to take a physical tour around the device. For the first time ever, Retroid is using a 4.5-inch 4:3 aspect ratio touchscreen AMOLED display that features a resolution of 1280 by 960 and is a true landscape panel with support for up to 120Hz refresh rate and a peak brightness of 500 nits. This display is the famed mortgage screen, which was custom made for this handheld and grew out of the controversy associated with the original Retroid Pocket Mini, which did not use a true 4:3 aspect ratio display, despite being made to look like it did. I think for many, this display will be worth the wait, and it definitely lives up to a lot of the excitement that the community has for a large and high resolution AMOLED panel that is in the 4:3 aspect ratio. It goes without saying that this display has excellent viewing angles, contrast, and scales beautifully for many retro-focused platforms. The leap from the Retroid Pocket Mini V1 to the NOVA is tremendous, and even against some very good IPS panels, like the one found on the RG476H or the RG477M for example, the AMOLED is going to be hard to ignore for those that have been waiting on a 4:3 display like the one found on the NOVA. And because the screen is such a big part of the experience, it sets the tone for everything else. So let's take a quick lap around the rest of the hardware and see how Retroid built the controls and chassis around it. Starting up top, we've got the stacked shoulder button and trigger we've seen in the past, and best of all, Retroid has brought back the texturing which was missing for the Retroid Pocket 6. The L1 and R1 press down nicely across the entirety of the button and are very quiet with a subtle clickiness to them. The triggers, which are Hall effect, are slightly larger than what we had on the Retroid Pocket Mini, and it does allow for a larger portion of your finger to press down on it. Across the top, we have the programmable M1 and M2 buttons as well as the power and volume controls. I do wish there was a bit of separation between these on the right side, since I do find myself having to check myself and make sure I'm pressing the right thing since they are all so closely spaced together. We also have the exhaust vent for the active cooling built into the NOVA up top. On the back of the unit, there's not a whole lot going on here. Or I should say there's a good amount going on if you've got one of the cool transparent models, which lets you appreciate some of the internals of the Nova. There's very minimal Retroid branding, and then we have the intake for the active cooling. By the way, in case you're wondering, the ice blue is definitely on the greener side, and while different lighting situations can alter the appearance a bit, I'd say that it's not a very blue ice blue, so just keep that in mind. I might as well comment on the plastic here, which feels really nice in the hands and has a matte texture, at least for this ice blue model. Now going front side, and we've got the D-pad up top, and like we saw with the Retroid Pocket 6, we've got a beautiful crystal style D-pad that is Vita inspired and similar to many of the prior Retroid devices. The D-pad here is excellent as always, with great movement all around and a very nice pivot at the center. And I've said this in the past, but I actually like this D-pad more than the Vitas. In terms of actual usage in game, I had no issues pulling off combos like a pro, even though I am nothing close to being one. On the opposite side, we have the face buttons in the Nintendo BAYX configuration, which, like the D-pad, have that same crystal effect and look gorgeous, especially when the lighting hits it at a certain angle. These are memory-based and might be the quietest that Retroid has ever put together, and these might even be quieter than the ones found on the Retroid Pocket 6. And they are most definitely a lot quieter than the clacky ones found on my beloved Retroid Pocket Mini. These buttons press down very smoothly and don't rub against the shell with a solid amount of travel and are just satisfying to use. We've got the return of the Jinful analog sticks, which are located at the bottom, and for PlayStation fans, this setup is going to make them very happy. The sticks have a nice range of movement, and these aren't anything new in terms of Retroid devices, as we have now seen them on quite a few handhelds. The caps are removable, and plenty of existing accessories, including the hype sticks that I have here, will work on here without issue. The sticks do sit above the face of the device just slightly, which I don't mind, as I do like having slightly larger sticks with that range of motion. I do want to say that if you're considering one of the transparent models, just be aware that the RGB lighting around the analog sticks will bleed through the shell. But thankfully the brightness of the RGB can easily be adjusted or just turned off completely. I figured this was worth pointing out, and really it's just a minor criticism. So below the analog sticks, we've got the front-firing stereo speakers, and I will say that these surprised me as I went back and compared them to the Retroid Pocket 6's speakers, and I think I might prefer the way these speakers sound on the Nova, which are quite punchy and get decently loud at the highest level. I'm definitely not an audio expert, and so I'll leave that judgment to far more talented individuals. I will say that the volume scaling has the same issues as I've found on other Retroid devices, so when you start to go below 50% volume, the audio starts to disappear. So let's enjoy a brief listening session here. Alright, back to business, and we do have 4 additional buttons on the front side for start, select, and then a dedicated home and back button for Android. Let's wrap this all up and take a moment and talk about the comfort, and I do think it's going to be highly dependent on what you're playing. For example, I found the Nova to be fairly uncomfortable when playing racing games, and even more so when talking about first-person shooters that rely on the triggers and the analog sticks at the same time. I would repeatedly have to adjust my form, since I would end up having to hold the Nova in some awkward way to make sure I could still retain a grip on the handheld while having enough force to also press down on the triggers. The repeated action of using the triggers in this combination definitely led to fatigue on my end. I did mention earlier that Retroid is including a bumped back shell as part of pre-orders, and I do wish they had included it for the review unit, since I am curious if that will help things out. I actually find the Retroid Pocket Mini to be slightly more comfortable, and that is in part thanks to the bump outs at the bottom, and so I'm hopeful that back shell will improve things there. Now, when it comes to just using it with the D-pad as the primary input method and the face buttons, or even just the analog stick and the face buttons, the handheld is quite comfortable this way and a joy to use. It's a lot more than I was expecting, given that it's just flat on the back, but I do think the slightly larger size compared to the Retroid Pocket Mini does help it out quite a bit. It's also fairly lightweight given what it's packing in this chassis, and that will almost certainly help with long-term fatigue. I imagine many will be happy that it does in fact have a flat back, since it takes up less of a footprint, and at least the option exists for a different back shell for those that are more like me. So as is tradition, we're gonna take this Nova and tear it all apart. Okay, maybe that was a bit aggressive, but we are going to take a look at how things are put together. This gives us an opportunity to examine battery access and check out how the D-pad and face buttons are keyed here for a potential swap. As always, if teardowns are not your thing, please feel free to skip ahead and check out all of the wonderful gaming that can be done on the Nova, but if you're sticking around, grab a snack because we've got a few things to go through here. It all begins with the removal of 4 Phillips screws on the back of the Nova, and I'm using a Phillips head size 00-bit for this process and for the entirety of the disassembly. Thanks to a little editing magic, we've got all the screws removed, and this backplate was a little tricky to get off as it's on there pretty well. I used one of iFixit's tools to get this open since I don't think my pick could handle the force and probably would have snapped in half. With enough force, I got some separation and then I was able to remove the rest by hand. The good news is that there is nothing connected to the backplate, so don't be worried about breaking any connectors. We've now got a nice look at this backplate and the pretty ice blue color that really is quite beautiful. Most importantly, we now have a look at the internals with that backplate removed, and as has been Retroid tradition, a very elegant looking unit with everything neatly assembled. Everything is nicely labeled with the left and right controls, and then we've got the fan assembly and of course the battery, which is probably the most recognizable element, and as we can see, it's listed as a 5000 mAh battery. Now at first glance, it looks like the battery might be easily removed, but as we will find out, that cable that is visible right below it is in fact for the speaker. So before we move forward, always make sure to remove any microSD cards and the thumbstick caps. Similar to other Retroid devices, the triggers pop off and then reveal access to additional screws. We will need to remove 3 screws for that top portion, and then we have 3 additional screws for the bottom portion. For this part, take care because the analog stick is attached to the plastic piece and there is a cable that is connected to the daughter board, so make sure to disconnect all cables by gently lifting up their tabs, and there are 3 connections in total here. The speaker is separate from the daughter board, but my unit has the cable going across the board, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the 2 screws holding the speaker in place just so that I don't accidentally ruin the cable. There are 3 screws holding the daughter board in place, and once these are removed, we now have access to the face buttons, which we can observe a whole lot closer than before, and these crystal style face buttons look so beautiful, especially at different angles. Now it just so happens that I have a set of face buttons from the AYN Thor, and a quick observation, and it does appear that these are keyed the same way with the exception of the A button, but that's not an issue if you're placing the Thor's face buttons into the Nova since it lacks the extra tab that we have on the Nova's set. The Thor's membrane is glued down in a different orientation than the one found on the Nova, so if you separate it from the membrane and reorient it into the Nova, the Thor's buttons work great here. I have to say I like the way the black looks with the ice blue, and I suspect that many in the community will be having fun putting together all sorts of color combinations, including myself, since I ordered the clear purple Nova with intentions to swap in the ice blue set to make an RTD themed Nova. The community once again was the inspiration for this, and thanks to the great tool that lets you dream up whatever design you have in mind, which I will have linked in the description. So I would have done the same test with the Retroid Pocket 6, but I've actually already cut those buttons up, and so instead I'll just provide a screen cap from that video which shows that the buttons are keyed the same exact way, and I did measure them to be the same exact size as the 6 and the Thor. Before we move on from the teardown, let's continue on to the other side and get access to the D-pad. It's much of the same as the left side, and so we're basically duplicating what we did there by removing the trigger cap, the top plastic portion, the bottom plastic portion, and then the speaker. Again, just make sure to disconnect any visible cables, and also as a little tip, if the magnets from the triggers are annoying you when you're trying to remove the screw, just press down on the trigger and hold it there until the screw has been removed. When you see the daughter board, there will be the same 3 screws that need to be removed, and be careful after you remove the screws and try to pop out that board because there is a cable that is connected underneath the fan assembly, and I did accidentally pull it out when I was maneuvering the daughter board, but luckily I didn't damage anything, and so my experience going through this will hopefully let you be mindful of these kind of moments. With all of that done, we have access to the D-pad, and this again gives us a closer look at the beautiful crystal D-pad. Once again, I have a D-pad from the Thor that we can compare and try to swap in with. And what's interesting is that I noticed the D-pad is smaller on the Thor. The membrane and D-pad from the Thor will fit inside the Nova's chassis without modifications, but you can see that there's a noticeable gap around the D-pad, and I did confirm it's smaller by measuring it, and then I went and grabbed a Retroid Pocket 6 D-pad, and this one is also smaller. I placed the Retroid Pocket 6's D-pad into the Nova shell, and you can also see that there's still a slight gap around the D-pad, just like with the Thor's D-pad. Also, I think I might have stumbled on a really cool color combination here. So basically, to sum it all up, the Nova appears to have a larger D-pad by 1mm compared to both the one found on the Retroid Pocket 6 and the Thor. Okay, let's get on with this teardown, and now we can tackle gaining access to the battery. Unfortunately, the cable that connects the battery is buried underneath this fan assembly, and so if you wanted to service the battery, you would begin by starting in this area. You don't need to worry about removing any other portion. Let's get the cables that are on the fan assembly disconnected first, and then we can start removing the screws that hold this entire plastic enclosure in place. There are 4 screws here to remove, and then 2 additional screws for the fan itself. Once all screws have been removed, the fan will be the first thing that comes out freely, and I'll just take a quick pause just in case anyone is curious about the fan specification. And then finally the plastic enclosure will come out as well. We now have access to the heatsink, but unfortunately we still have no access to that connection for the battery. The heatsink is held into place with 4 additional screws, and then with those removed, the heatsink will lift right out of the chassis. This now finally gives us access to the battery connection, and with that, I've satisfied what I wanted to achieve with this teardown. But before we dive into gaming, let's go through the quickest benchmarks possible, and since we've seen this chipset countless times before, you can always check those devices out, which I've covered in the past, for a more in-depth analysis. Basically, the standard, performance, and high performance are functionally the same in terms of performance, and I've observed this in the past with retro devices, including the Retroid Pocket 6. The numbers observed here on the Nova are essentially the same as I observed on the Retroid Pocket 6. Now, knowing this, we can set ourselves up for the gaming showcase, which I'll use just the standard performance preset with the quiet fan option. And yes, in terms of thermals, the quiet fan option alone does make a significant difference in terms of stability, as can be seen with the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme Stress Test. I will note that during more demanding gaming, such as PC gaming, the temperatures will get up there, and so for heavier gaming, I'd probably set it to the smart fan option and just let it do its thing. Now, the sport fan setting is quite noisy, and there's a pretty awful whine to the fan that's noticeable at the highest setting. Thankfully, we don't really need to keep it at that sports setting, and again, all the gameplay footage that you see in the following sections were recorded with the quiet fan setting, and that is how I personally use the device for the entirety of my testing, which does get a little warm on the left side when pushing the device hard, so you will feel it with your fingers on that left side, but it's not to the point that you're going to be burning your fingers off. Alright, we're now ready to get into what the Nova was made to do, and that's, of course, gaming, and let me tell you, it can do a whole lot of it. I'll start with an area that maybe doesn't get as much attention, but native Android gaming is actually something that will work quite well with the Nova, since not only do we have a good amount of power under the hood to handle a large portion of what is available on the Play Store, many Android games will actually scale correctly to the aspect ratio of the display. I recently did a video about this topic if you're curious to find some additional gems, and I do have an ongoing playlist of awesome Android games that are available and work well with our retro Handheld devices. For all the Android games I tested, as I mentioned, I had the Nova on the standard performance preset and the quiet fan setting. Now for those that know me, I did my usual roundup including games like Genshin Impact and Wuthering Waves, which both ran great and look beautiful here on this display. Not only that, but they scale very well, and thanks to the chipset, we can run these games at 60 frames per second with high settings for Genshin Impact and the quality preset for Wuthering Waves. Of course, we can't forget about some popular first-person shooters like Call of Duty Mobile, which does support the built-in controls of the Pocket Nova, and the experience with the Nova is really solid. I have the game set to the Ultra FPS option, which means we can make use of the 120Hz refresh rate that we have on hand here. Unfortunately, it does default to medium settings, and I can't override that without losing the high FPS option, but regardless, this is another game that scales well and runs very well here. The same goes for a personal favorite of mine with the native Android version of Warframe, and I have the game set to the highest settings available with a 60 frames per second target, and again, it's just not much of an issue for the Nova, and it handles this game with ease. So while we're on the topic of shooters, I did test Fortnite, and at first I was not able to get this from the Play Store, which, by the way, is available now on the Google Play Store directly, but on the Nova specifically, it won't come up in search. No worries, I went to the Epic Games website and then I downloaded the Epic Games store and sideloaded it through their app, and the good news is that this method does work and we can enjoy Fortnite on here, and this is another great showing for the Nova since I'm running this game at 120 frames per second using the Epic texture setting with medium quality. So I wanted to change it up a little bit and check out a game that I have not kept up with, and so I decided to load up that game company's Sky Children of Light, and I was actually blown away by how much has changed since the last time I checked it out. This is a gorgeous game on the Nova's display, and I have it set to the max FPS and max resolution options, and it does very well here. I'm gonna actually need to put some real time into this one. Alright, let's now switch gears and talk about emulation, and there's a lot to cover here, and that's because there's a lot that can be enjoyed with the Nova. I think it goes without saying that retro platforms like Super Nintendo, N64, Dreamcast, and countless other consoles will work beautifully with the 4:3 aspect ratio display. We have the power on hand here to enjoy these platforms with relative ease, and so as is tradition, let's see how far we can push the Nova. For me personally, one area that I was very excited about was the 6th generation, since this is typically seen as the last generation that still widely supported the 4:3 aspect ratio. I think many will really enjoy Gamecube emulation on the Nova, and for this I used the Dolphin emulator straight from the Play Store and just set it to 3 times the native resolution of Gamecube, which is the equivalent of a 1080p resolution and obviously exceeds what we have here with the Nova's display. It goes without saying that games like F-Zero GX and Wave Race Blue Storm look gorgeous and will be a highlight for many with this device. The same goes for the Nintendo Wii using the same Dolphin emulator, and I still kept everything at 3 times the native resolution of the Wii. I feel like the Wii does get overlooked here, and it actually supports the 4:3 aspect ratio more than one might imagine, despite it being part of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 generation. Now there's a few ways to go about this, and one thing that I did personally was go into the system menu in the Dolphin emulator, and then set the system to the 4:3 aspect ratio. This is actually different than just picking the 4:3 option in the emulator settings. The change for the system menu actually triggers internally that we have a 4:3 TV, and so many games will adjust accordingly. For example, here I have Super Mario Galaxy 2, and if you pay attention to some of the elements on screen, you will see that there is a difference here even though I chose the 4:3 option in the Dolphin emulator settings. I do know that there are also codes out there that will allow you to force 4:3 on stubborn games, but definitely try the system menu option first. Of course, we can't forget about the PlayStation 2, and this is another console that I am really excited about with this handheld. Not only that, I'm also excited that we now have a new option for PlayStation 2 emulation on Android with the ARM SX2 emulator, and thanks to Joey from Joey's Retro Handheld, and of course Russ from Retro Gamecore, for inspiring me to give this new emulator a shot because I am very impressed. I love the modern interface, and I'm actually blown away by how solid the performance is this early on in the emulator's development. I had to actually stop myself at one point and remember that I'm trying to put together a video here since I was having a lot of fun testing a bunch of games. During that spree, I managed to make a return visit to the Grand Canyon, which has been long overdue, and I do actually need to make a drive up there again. I figured while I had GT4 running, I might as well pay a visit to New York, the place where I was born and raised. For everything that you've seen on the PS2 side, I tested at 4 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, again well beyond the native resolution of the display. Now I imagine many were not expecting this, but Xbox emulation on Android is actually a thing, and has seen some progress, but still does have a ways to go in terms of optimization and compatibility. Regardless, I did want to feature some Xbox emulation here because I think the display is a great fit for this console as well. I will say I was pleasantly surprised by where we are with the X1 box emulator. I have been on a bit of a Halo kick recently, probably inspired by the release of Halo Campaign Evolved, and so it just seemed right to test out Halo Combat Evolved, and it does decently with this chipset. It is an area where more power from something like the 8 Elite or 8 Elite Gen 5 is useful to help brute force performance, and I will say it did crash on me while I was testing. I definitely consider Xbox a bonus platform to experiment with. While we're talking about experimentation, I did a bit of that with Retroid's own dual screen attachment, and it was something that I was not expecting to enjoy as much as I did, since naturally attachments are always a bit cumbersome, and that does still hold true for getting this all set up. I will say that the attachment lines up very well with the USB-C port on the bottom, although the top does leave a bit to be desired since it does block the volume and power controls, but I imagine we will see a 3D printed solution from the community in no time. I do think it's nice to have the option to do it, but in particular what I really love about the combination here is the 4:3 aspect ratio display on the Nova, serving as a proper bottom screen for both the DS and the 3DS. And in particular for the DS, the bottom 4.5-inch screen on the Nova lines up with the top screen of the dual screen attachment when it's displaying a 4:3 image, and leaves me wanting a dedicated handheld with 2 of these screens. But for right now, I will take this combination since it's pretty glorious, and as much as I like the Thor, this setup reminds me of my beloved Surface Duo with the giant AMOLED displays. As expected, performance is solid for both DS and 3DS, and I did use MeloDS for DS emulation while sticking with Azahar for 3DS, which I have running at 3 times the native resolution of the 3DS, and these games look so sharp and beautiful on both of these displays since they're both AMOLED and match up really well. I did test out some Wii U with the Seeing emulator, and this is a nice way to get some extra use cases out of the Nova if you have the dual screen attachment. And while the Nova serving as the bottom screen isn't the most ideal solution since the gamepad was a 16:9 display, it's still pretty cool if the Nova is the only handheld you have on hand and also happen to own this screen attachment. Finally, for some fun bonuses, I thought that since we've got a fairly compact and lightweight handheld here with the Nova and the way the controls are set up, that we can get away with some TATE mode action, which is great with the 4:3 screen and scales perfectly for many shmups like the countless options available with the PlayStation 2, such as Ibarra, which I have running here and I set custom controls for it as a per game option, so it's super easy to get things running. I also couldn't resist, and I did want to talk very briefly about PlayStation 3 emulation using RPCSX, and we do have APS-3E as another option as well. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, I meant the QCS8550 is not quite as performant when it comes to brute forcing a lot of games, but there's still plenty to experiment with here if you're interested, and I'd say lighter PSN style games will be your best bet. This was a transition period for both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in terms of the shift from 4.3 to 16:9 content, but there are games that natively will support 4.3 on the PS3 when the resolution is set to 480p or 480i. It's not great since it's a bit of a mess to figure out what it does, and there are community lists out there, but I think at the end of the day, for most that will be exploring PS3, you'll probably just want to set the 4.3 option in the emulator and then let it crop out some elements like what you see here with Resogun, which actually isn't too bad. And this is a perfect opportunity to talk about those 16:9 platforms like the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation Portable, which probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind for most people, considering the Nova, since the obvious draw here is that beautiful and large 4.3 display. But I will say that 16:9 content is still decent here because of the larger 4.5-inch screen. And so it's another one of those fun bonuses, since it just means that you can explore platforms like the PSP and Switch if you're wanting to keep things to one device. The same goes for the 3:2 aspect ratio like on the Game Boy Advance, which actually yields a fairly large screen with just minimal bars, and so it does show that a larger 4.3 display can be quite versatile to cover your needs beyond just 4.3 gaming. Now, despite my excitement for platforms like the PlayStation 2 and GameCube, I think the PC platform is probably the most exciting for me personally, since not only has PC gaming on Android come a long way since my videos covering Winlator with the Retroid Pocket Mini in terms of compatibility and performance, but we now have more options including both Gamehub and Gamenative, which let us pursue this dream of PC gaming on our Android-based devices. The PC platform is home to tens of thousands of games, and best of all, many of these games will support the 4:3 aspect ratio in-game, especially when you start to think about older games. There are a few Steam curated lists like Does It 4:3 and the 4:3 full screen aspect ratio list, but I will say that the game can run with the various options like Gamenative or Gamehub. Don't be afraid to test and try out games that aren't on these lists, since the lists only touch upon a very small segment of the PC platform. I tested a range of games, including some older gems like Wolfenstein 2009, to everyone's favorite benchmark game Grand Theft Auto 5, and these games all supported the 1280x960 resolution of the Nova's display. For games like Wolfenstein, performance is just simply amazing, running at high settings and 60 frames per second, and then there were pleasant surprises like fairly new releases such as Megabomb, which ran at or close to 120 frames per second using low settings to really make use of that refresh rate here. And then of course everything in between like Sleeping Dogs and even some Halo 4 from the Halo Master Chief Collection, once again satisfying my crave for as much Halo as possible. I also happen to have Breaking Benjamin's Blow Me Away on loop, which only served to keep me even more pumped up for the Nova. So before we move on from all of this gaming, I did want to touch upon some game streaming with the Nova, since we do have the full range of controls. I imagine someone out there will want to do this, and I'm just here to show you what can be done. The good news is that the QCS8550, wow, that's a terrible name, is quite solid for streaming, and I'm using the combination of Artemis and Apollo to stream locally from my desktop PC. Now, I thought to myself, why not stream using a 4:3 aspect ratio for my PC at the Nova's native resolution of 1280x960 with 120 frames per second, and that's exactly what I did with Halo Campaign Evolved, which to my delight supports 4.3 in-game. I think this is a good solution for those more demanding PC games or perhaps games that support 4.3 but aren't quite compatible with the various options available for PC gaming on Android. And with sub 2 millisecond native decoding times, the experience is quite solid here. And finally, before we head on out of here, let's talk about the battery performance after all of this gaming, and for the lightest test I used Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo at a 50% brightness and volume with the standard performance preset. The fans turned off as well as both Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and RGB turned off using the power saver option, and we ended up at a little over 16 hours of on-screen time, and it outperformed the Retroid Pocket Mini from back in the day, which had a smaller battery. And then for a more demanding test, I used God of War 2 with ARM SX2 at that same 50% brightness and volume, using the same standard performance preset with the quiet fan option and the Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and RGB still turned off, which came in at just shy of 4 hours and 30 minutes when that super battery saver came on and tanked performance. I was pleasantly surprised by this since I went back and looked at my numbers for the Retroid Pocket 6, which has a 6000 mAh battery mind you, and the Nova matched it in terms of battery life, and so I do suspect that ARM SX2 is actually giving us a little more bang for the buck, as they say. I did test the advertised 27 watt charging capability, and I observed about 26 watts charging, which is right on target, and a 30-minute charge yielded about 43%, with a full 0% to 100% charge taking about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And so, we've reached the end of this video, and I think it goes without saying that for many, this handheld might be the end, as in the end game of 4.3 handhelds. Personally, I'm really enjoying the Retroid Pocket Nova, and for me at least, it's exactly the kind of follow-up I was hoping for coming from the Retroid Pocket Mini. There's no doubt that if you're looking for a dedicated 4.3 handheld, the Nova brings a nicely rounded set of features that will make this easily a fan favorite for a long time to come. I don't think it's going to be the last time we see the Nova here, and so until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.